Hi, my name is Ashley Herndon. I am a group fitness instructor and I'm here to help my fellow group fitness instructors. Today we're going to talk about cueing. So cueing is one of those things that can be the difference between a good class and a great class. Great cueing can up-level your class. Your students walk away with clarity, less confusion. They know and understand what they're going to do, and maybe they even understand how to feel that movement in their own bodies. So in our textbooks, ACE, NASM, AFA, all of these wonderful organizations, we learn about the system of 3 different learners. Now, no person is one of these singularly. The idea is that one of these, each person will use as their primary method. So we have our visual learners, which is, according to sources, 60 to 70% of people respond as visual learners first. Then we have our verbal, or sometimes listed as auditory learners. These are the people who respond to spoken cueing. Finally, we have our kinesthetic learners. These are the people who experience learning through feeling, through tactile sensations. Now, the hard part is taking what we learn on paper and translating it to our actual group fitness classes. So we're going to talk through each one of these 3 parts of learning as defined in our textbooks, and then we're going to go beyond them. And we're going to talk about why our cues have to go beyond those and why the style of learning has actually been debunked by experts. So we're going to start with our visual learners. Our visual learners are the people who respond primarily through sight, through demoing. Now, no matter what your technique, no matter what approach you believe, visual learning is an important part of our input as humans. We really do monkey see, monkey do. We see, we respond. So, first and foremost, you have demoing. You demo the movement, the students do it back. They get a visual representation. But there are other visual cues that can go past this. So, for instance, maybe you do a countdown as you approach the end. 4, 3, 2, 1. I don't have to say it. You get that same input. Maybe you're cueing a direction. Maybe you're cueing which leg and a direction to go to. All of this I'm doing too while sitting in one position, but you can still get an idea for what that looks like. There are other more specific visual cues that may provide, say, dance fitness, which relies very heavily on visual cues, may have specific cues for repeating or double time. Then there are cues that help alignment. Now, we don't think of these necessarily as visual cues. However, what if I want people a little bit taller? What if I want you to find length through your spine? What if I want your knees over your toes? There are lots of ways you can visually indicate as you are verbally cueing. Now let's move on to our verbal cues. Verbal cues, a huge part of our learning as well. Our primary means of communication as humans tends to be communication unless that verbal communication is altered in some way. So some of our methods, dance fitness relies heavily on visual, may still use some auditory cues. Those might not even be words themselves. They could be sounds. Huh! Right? We have these sounds that still stimulate some auditory response. We know we hear that sound, we're going to respond. So there's also clapping. Clapping is an auditory response. We could clap without actually using words. That's another popular one in dance fitness. Then we have modalities like yoga and Pilates, which rely very heavily on verbal cueing. Do we still have visual cues? Even if you are not demoing as an instructor, the participants in your class are taking visual cues off of the other students in the class. So they are still taking in visual information. You say down dog, that person who's never gone to class looks and was like, oh, this must be down dog. Now, hopefully we give them a little more explanation as we do that. Our verbal cueing is very important, and the clarity in which we verbal cue, which involves taking out extra words, taking out sometimes encouraging words so that we can focus in. Our brain also has a limited capacity for how many cues it can take in at once. So you don't want to overload somebody verbally by throwing out everything in the book. We don't want to tell them about your knee alignment and their back alignment, and maybe you can also do this. We give them time to digest each cue. If you're doing 2 sets, maybe you cue the same cue because it didn't happen quite the first time, but maybe that one's already there, so you can move on to another verbal cue. Lots of options within verbal cueing for how you do that and how you talk to people. This one most of us understand pretty clearly. Now we can use verbal cues to also engage with our kinesthetic learners and our visual learners. So there are keywords like watch, look, see, that indicate to someone to switch their brain. If it were, we'll talk about why that doesn't necessarily happen in a minute, but there are cues that will inspire people to pay attention more to the image in front of them. There are also cues that work for the tactile senses. Feel, engage, release, anything that creates a sensation within the body. Even observe. While observe can be visual, if we're asking someone to observe internally, it becomes more of that kinesthetic. Our kinesthetic cues are the cues that involve tactile feelings. Tactile is, for most of us, touch. It's that sense. Now, a lot of kinesthetic cueing, the first thing we think of is, oh no, hands-on corrections. You can teach kinesthetic style cues without ever having to do a hands-on by using some of these keywords. Find length through the back of your calf by dropping that heel. There are words that we can use. You can also engage with kinesthetic cues with metaphoric cues. So maybe you say, lengthen your arms overhead like a ballerina. Okay, I have an image. Imagery, kinesthetic, what is it? Now this is where those lines start to blur. Our kinesthetic cues are more for people who feel like they need to feel something in their body to engage. That's the important part of it. And that feel may be by a physical adjustment, if those are prohibited in your studio. However, we have gotten more creative. We know that hands-on adjustments are not necessarily beneficial, and they can be a liability or not even permitted in some areas. Now, we're going to keep moving on to talk about why these 3 ideas are almost limited. What we have learned in recent years is that our brains are incredible. They're incredibly complex, and isolating down our learning habits to 3 styles is insanely limiting. But what we have learned through studies, and there is plenty of research to back this out. I'm not going to quote everything, but if you want, I will shoot me a message and I will happily send you some sources. You can also check in Learning Styles Debunked is a great search, and there instantly is a section that provides some scholarly research on this. What we know is we learn best through a multi-sensory approach. That means everyone learns better when you're actively engaging multiple senses. So we have our visual, we have our verbal, we have some sensations. We can use metaphor to engage some other senses. There is a movement here, rounding the spine. We always call this scooping ice cream. You can pick your flavor. Suddenly we're engaging a different part of the brain because we're talking about flavor and taste. We know our brain lights up in various parts the more senses we engage. So the more senses we can engage, the more we are helping reinforce learning patterns. The other way our brain works and learns is through repetition. So if you're afraid that you've given the same cue for squat 3 weeks in a row, don't. Because as a fitness instructor, I've done this for how long? I was in class recently and someone said, don't lock your knees. Now I know not to lock my knees, however, my body was still locking its knees despite the fact that I know. So we can always use reminders of those cues. You can do a squat 700 times, but saying weight in the heels, can you wiggle those toes? Reminding people that they're sitting back in those hips, that they're lengthening their spine. All of those cues help us learn and help us not sink into habits. Our cueing can release people from bad habits. Even if they have good technique, those habits may come in just because we're tired, because we're not feeling it that day. Our body wants to try to find what it feels is more efficient at the time, even though we may not necessarily be in our most efficient state of movement at that time. So using repetition, using a multisensory approach, if it helps to think about these 3 ideas, if that helps you as a teacher, use it. Most importantly, we want to engage people in as many ways as possible. We want to not over cue to the point that we have overloaded the brain, but we want to continue giving the same cue in different ways. That may mean if you look out and your whole class isn't quite getting that movement, how can you say that in a different way? Is there something in our life that connects to that? Our brain also, crazy thing, our brain learns by connecting to what we already know. So if I tell you, we are going to inhale deeply like you're smelling a flower. Well, our brain has, oh, I smell a flower through my nose. It already has a connection, a pathway there. So by acknowledging what we already know and connecting to that, if I'm saying, weight in your heels in your squat, weight in your heels, sit back, and it's not clicking in, sit back like you're sitting in an invisible chair. Suddenly one person gets it. That's still not working. Sometimes we can go for the toilet humor. Sit like you're sitting on the toilet. I've used it before for someone who didn't get chair and suddenly toilet, they got that perfect, beautiful squat. So you never know what is going to connect with people. So continue trying those different styles of cues and try to make connections with each person and continue to repeat those cues in new ways until you find something that really resonates with your population. I hope this was helpful. This was our video on cueing for various learners, and I will continue to make more. Maybe if you want a second video on cueing or order of importance for cueing, let me know in the comments below. Thank you.